Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I hope that everyone is doing well. Welcome to our third class of an introduction to Islamic law. Inshallah, today we possibly might go over time. As I said before at the very beginning, that there will be one or two sessions, we will slightly go over an hour. So hopefully not, but if we do go over an hour, feel free to leave by an hour and then watch it later if you need to, or you can stay on with us, inshallah. All right. See, there's questions coming in. I'll take a look in a bit. Begin that screen share. Bismillah, let me know when you can see my screen. Somebody can just drop it in the chat. All right. So today's topic is going to be about the four Mujtahid Imams, or what's known in Arabic as Al-A'imma Al-Arba'a. And in our last class, we basically spoke about the history of the development of Islamic law. So we went from the period of the Prophet ﷺ to the very early period of the Tabi'in, which are the first people to meet the companions of the Prophet ﷺ after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ. We spoke about the methodology that is used during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ. Then we spoke about the methodology that was added after the life of the Prophet ﷺ and some of the reasons for that. We also did a kind of an exercise in terms of some of the scenarios that showed up during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions' reaction to those scenarios. So today what we will do is we will begin with, here's the timeline actually, just so we have a sense of where we are. And I've also made a new timeline, kind of pushing everything to the side except for our focus today, so you'll see that as well. So we are in this area, this middle area. We did the time of the Prophet, the time immediately after the Prophet, during the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the companions, the early or the senior Tabi'in, the successors that came after the companions, and then we're coming into this area of the Mujtahid Imams. We also discussed and spoke about, actually the next chart might have it, spoke about, when I pull it up, but we spoke about the fact that these weren't the only four schools or the only mujtahids that were there. We will define again what a mujtahid is, but these weren't the only people that began, in a sense, their own madhhab or their own school of thought or their own methodology. We said that during this time, you have many other scholars like Al-Layth ibn Sa'd, right? He had his own madhab in a sense. You have Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, who's considered, I think last time I said the fifth Shia Imam, he's actually the sixth Shia Imam for the Imami Shias in their line of 12 Imams. He also has a madhab attributed to his name as well. Imam Zayd ibn Ali, there's a madhab based off of him, Imam al-Awza'i. So these are all different mujtahids that are there that had their own system in a sense. And then we spoke about some of the reasons why these four madhabs caught on, right? Some of them had to do with being the fact that a lot of students held the madhab after the imam or spread the madhab, or the teachings caught on, or that a state adopted, or even a city or a certain area adopted that as the official legal system or the madhab of that area. So those were reasons, right? And it's not just one reason, there are multiple factors that cause these madhabs to survive. And obviously that is through the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well. So these four madhabs are the major four madhabs of the Sunni Islam that we have. And we left off with a question. So right now, so far, we're just doing a recap of everything that we did. For those that didn't attend last class, make sure you go and watch it so you have an idea of what we're discussing. We left off with a question, and that was, how do we find Islamic rulings? So go ahead, the chat is open. This was a semi-research question, something to think about. I also gave you a post-class reading to reflect over and to think about how we find Islamic rulings. So go ahead and put any answers, any thoughts, and if you didn't, look into it, put whatever thoughts you have in mind as well in the chat. All right, I have some answers coming in. All right, when I say how do we find Islamic rulings, I'm talking about us, like as individuals. We're not talking about mujtahids or anything of that sort, just so we're on the same page. All right, these answers are coming in. So this was the question we left off with, and it was a sort of mental exercise as well. It was a sort of a trick question because I didn't really write the answer there, or else it would have kind of given you the answer. It is fiqh. So we don't find, or we don't, if I want to find an Islamic ruling, I don't go to the Quran or to the hadith books, right? I go to the books of fiqh, the legal books. And that comes in different forms. So you can go to a fiqh book, or you can go to a book of fatawa, or you can ask your local imam for the fiqh ruling, or you can see the rulings of certain fiqh councils, right? But the idea is you get your Islamic rulings from the works of fiqh, not from the books of tafsir and also the books of hadith, right? That is a common mistake that we find, that people go to the books of hadith and then they say this is the ruling that needs to be followed. And although this is the third class, we should have an idea of why that methodology is incorrect and also impractical, right? Because we have different hadith that are there. We have different methodologies of understanding the hadith. We have hadith that seem to contradict each other at face value. There's a lot of understanding and there's an entire system that the hadith have to filter out through in order for it to be presentable or to be acted upon. The other thing that, and for those that are more interested in hadith, we did an entire class in the summer. I think it's about 20 sessions, so it's longer than this class is going to be, through the sciences of hadith, and that talks about the different methodologies that's used to determine whether a hadith is sahih, hadith is used or not. And there's a class in there, I don't remember which class specifically, so if somebody remembers from here that took that class, let us know, so we can suggest people to watch that specific class. But we talked about the relationship between fiqh and hadith, and how they overlap, and how the scholars of fiqh viewed hadith and how they used hadith. And also, if you remember, hadith is going to be one of the sources, right? Sunnah is the sources, hadith comes under the sunnah. So it's one of the sources that the mujtahid, the person that's able to understand and extract Islamic ruling, uses amongst other sources. So it's not the only source. And because it's not the only source, you can't just take the ruling directly from the hadith. It might be a hadith that is not acted upon. It might be a hadith that the ruling is cancelled. To give you an example, if you open the book of hadith, you'll find hadith that are sahih that mention that a companion was praying and somebody else walked in, and this companion that walked in says assalamu alaikum. Now this person's praying and he goes wa alaikum salam, right? I think we spoke about this example as well. Can you act upon that hadith? It's a sahih hadith, right? No, right? You go to the rulings of fiqh, you find out that in fiqh you cannot act upon that hadith because that hadith or that ruling or that action is abrogated, it's cancelled, and there's a different ruling. So for that reason, we turn to the books of fiqh or the works of fiqh or fiqh in general to understand, to take, to learn, to act upon an Islamic ruling. There was another question. So we're still not really into today's subject yet, but these are some of the follow-ups that some of the questions that we had at the last class, but we said we'll tackle so everybody can benefit from these questions. Do we need to follow a school of thought or methodology, right? The short answer for this is yes. You have to follow a methodology. Now, you don't have to follow, quote unquote, a madhab per se, like by name. Some of the scholars say that al-ammi, the lay person, the lay individual, does not have a specific madhab. They can just follow their local imam. But the idea is that you are consistent, or you try to follow a certain methodology. The idea is to counter, and we're not going to get into the details of this, but the idea is you don't want to be following your desires. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, He says, وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا الْهَوَى. Don't follow your desires or your inclinations. So the idea is not to go fatwa shopping, not to see, oh, this one's easier here, this one's easier here, this one's easier here. Now, there are certain situations, like when we study fatwa, how to give fatwa, right? And there's different methodologies that are used in giving fatwa. So one of the examples I can give you is, say somebody is in a dire situation and they cannot, um, uh, for example, the Hanafi madhab doesn't allow you to combine your prayers when you're traveling, or for any other reason for that matter. Somebody follows the Hanafi madhab, now they're in a situation where they will miss the prayer, or they're in a situation where they need to combine, and that's the only methodology. In those cases, scholars give fatwa that you can act upon the opinion of the Shafi'i madhab because of a valid reason. But the idea is not to go searching around or to be fatwa shopping. So in reality, everybody follows a method. Sometimes you'll have people saying that, oh, I don't follow a madhab, I follow the Quran and Sunnah. That is incorrect. That's not true. Not incorrect as in they're not doing it. That's untrue as in they are following a methodology. So they're either following the opinions of such and such scholar that it's telling them that this is the hadith out of the entire works of hadith that you have to act upon, right? Based off of whatever methodology that scholar is using. That scholar might say, I'm not using the methodology of the four madhabs or whatever it may be. In reality, there is no such thing unless you yourself are a mujtahid and extracting and finding reasoning behind the contradiction of this hadith, that hadith, going against the ayah, understanding the maslaha, understanding public policy within Islamic structures, understanding the purposes of Islamic legislation, the purposes behind the revelation of these verses, the depth or in-depth knowledge of the Quranic Arabic or Arabic language in general, the possible different qira'at of that same verse, right? There's an immense amount of knowledge you have to be able to extract an opinion yourself. So in reality, we are all following a methodology. Even people who claim that let's follow Quran and Sunnah. Because if I were to give somebody a mushaf, a Quran, and say, find, tell me how to pray from the Quran, you won't be able to. You'll need to go to the opinions of scholars, whether that scholar be Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Shafi'i, Imam al-Bukhari, Sheikh Albani, whoever it may be. You will have to refer back to somebody because you're not able to extract those opinions yourself. So in reality, you are following a methodology, and this idea, right, this verbal statement that I don't follow the madhabs, rather I follow the Quran and Sunnah, is completely incorrect. And this is, again, the traditional view on the madhahib. If you did the reading of that blog that I sent as a post reading, it wasn't part of the class reading, but it was just a post reflection somebody wrote, not from the class, somebody else wrote. You'll see that in order for a person to have an understanding of the Quran and Sunnah, these madhahib are some of the earliest sources that you have, right? When we're looking at the generations, especially today, we'll discuss these Imams. Imam Abu Hanifa is from the Tabi'i. He's from the successors. He's met companions. Although he did not narrate from companions, he's met companions, which means he's from the earliest generations of the Salaf itself. So whose understanding would be greater? Somebody who's from the earliest generation of the Salaf, or somebody who's come 50 years ago, right? And again, it also depends. If the issue is a contemporary issue, that has a different circumstance. If you're talking about going back and revising the fara'id or the sunnahs of prayer, or what elements of prayer that you need to do or whatnot, and the rulings regarding that, that's completely different as well. So the reality is we all follow a methodology. Here's another fallacy that we find, which is, why don't we follow the majority opinion? And again, this is we're not going into the four Imams yet. That will be right after this, inshallah. But this is another question that comes up. Why don't we follow the majority? We have four madhabs. Why don't we just take the majority? So if three madhabs say this, or if the majority of madhabs are saying this, this causes an issue for multiple reasons. I've written a few here. Number one, what constitutes a majority, right? As we discussed last time, the Hanafi madhab itself is about 50% of the ummah, which means by far majority of the scholars are going to be Hanafi. Are we basing it off of fuqaha, the scholars of fiqh? Are we giving each madhab an equal say? What if there's no majority? Then who determines which one do we follow? What if each of them have a different opinion, right? Each madhab adds its own opinion on this. Who gets to decide which one is the stronger opinion? You have to remember these madhabs, as we'll see throughout this course, each one of them have their own methodology. And although the four major sources of all four of these madhabs are the same, their methodology in determining what is the sunnah is different. Their methodology in understanding the ayat of the Quran, what does this Arabic word mean? It has two possible meanings. Which one do we apply? Right? When you look at some of the basic books of fiqh, they'll start you off with these concepts. Right? It has two meanings. The Shafis and the Hanafis differ on the meaning of a certain word. Which one do we apply? They're both valid meanings in the Arabic language. It's a matter of difference of opinion. It's a matter of methodology. So think of it this way. These are four different filters. If you put the same products through these filters, there are four different filters, you'll have different results. It's not that this hadith didn't reach this person or that hadith didn't reach that person, or if they had the exact same hadith and ayat, then they would have the exact same results. That's not true. Their methodology, their approach, their thinking is different. Remember the example of Bani Qurayza, right? The example of Bani Qurayza that we did, where the companions, they differed over the words of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said, don't pray Asr until you reach that fort, until you reach Bani Qurayza. Some of them said, we're not going to stop here. We're going to continue until we reach Asr, even though the time for Asr was finishing. Others said, well, that was not the intent. That was not the reasoning behind the Prophet ﷺ's statement. So the companions differed. They had different methodology. It was the same hadith, the same statement. So for that reason, these four madhabs, you'll always find a difference within them because the reasoning, the methodology itself is different. I hope that's clear, inshallah. If you guys have any follow-up questions, feel free to type them. I will look at them towards the end or when we take a little break, inshallah. All right, now when you study a madhab, so like I said, the ammi, the lay person, as an average person, you don't need to have a specific madhab. You can just follow, if a fiqh question comes up, you can follow a reliable, local scholar. If you follow somebody online that's reliable, you can do that as well, whatever works for you, inshallah. But if you are serious about studying fiqh, if you're studying fiqh and you're planning to study a fiqh book or a methodology, in that case, you have to choose a madhab. There's no, a lot of times people, not a lot of times, sorry, at times, students go into this thinking that, you know what, I will learn all four madhabs at once. That's not how it happens, right? That's like saying that I am going to learn, instead of one set of laws, instead of, the US laws, I'm going to learn the legal systems of the US, the UK, France, and a bunch of others at the same time, right? It's too much. So you begin with one madhab, you perfect the foundations within that madhab, the usul, the principles within that madhab, and then you move on to comparative. And then you'll notice that that builds a stronger foundation. If you come across people who've studied comparative in the beginning, they'll all tell you this. Once they advance to fiqh, they'll tell you to start with a madhab. They'll tell you to start with one. And this is because they've been through that journey where they tried to do comparative and it just becomes a mess. They don't have foundations that are set in one madhab. They don't have a single source that they can refer back to, that this is a consistent methodology. Rather, it's kind of a pick and choose from here and there. So again, if you're studying a madhab, you need to, at that time, determine what fiqh you're going to study. And all of them are perfectly fine to study as well. So, usually the fiqh just depends on where you happen to be born for the most part. For us that live in multicultural societies like the United States, the United Kingdom, or Canada, and many other countries as well now, you have people from different areas, from different regions. And that's why you become aware that, oh wait, this person's doing something differently. That's the Shafi'i madhab. This person's doing this completely different. That's the Hanbali madhab, or that's the Maliki madhab. So you become aware of these. But if you're living in a country where there are no differences of opinion, everybody's just following the one methodology they learn, you might not even know what madhab that is, but depending on your region, it could be the Hanafi madhab, the Shafi'i madhab, the Maliki madhab, the Hanbali madhab, without even knowing the name of that madhab. Now with the internet, obviously you're introduced to many things as well. All right, so this is an updated, an updated chart that I made. So now we will begin with these four madhahib. Okay, let me look at these questions. All right, I'll answer these towards the end. These are some good questions. All right, so Bismillah. This updated chart, I've made it a little more detailed. What I did, I took the two ends and I pushed them to the side. So they are not, perfectly balanced in terms of the spacing, right? So I've just pushed the two things that we're not paying attention to the side and zoomed in on this era of the Mujtahideen, this era of the four Imams. And I've added other names just to show us a little bit of the time period that, for example, Imam Zayd ibn Ali, who the Zaydi madhab goes back to. Remember, we spoke about the famous Shia madhabs that are there. One of them, which the Zaydi Shias follow, goes back to Zayd ibn Ali, who's the great grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, great. And he is born around the same time as Imam Abu Hanifa. Another thing I want to mention, these dates, they're not specific. So sometimes you'll find the exact date that I put on here. Sometimes you'll find one or two in front, one or two in back, right? So there's different narrations. It could be, 151 or 152 instead of 150. So think of it as a soft date, as close as possible. So Imam Zayd ibn Ali, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is here as well. He's born, some say 80, some say 83. So he's right around the time of Imam Abu Hanifa as well. You have Imam al-Awza'i, you have Imam Malik. So now notice the difference between Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, right? Between their births, there's about 13 years difference. Imam al-Layth ibn Sa'ad is around this time as well, who's another mujtahid. He's another scholar that can extract legal rulings, and he did that during his lifetime. His madhab it just ended up dying out. Many actually say it's because of Imam Shafi'i. So Imam Shafi'i, towards the end of his life, went to Egypt and attracted a lot of the students that were originally studying with al-Layth or whatnot, and they carried on the Shafi'i madhab. But there's multiple reasonings as well. This is 100 years after Hijrah. So this is approximately 90 years after the passing away of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. 100 years after Hijrah, the mark is here. Here's the 200-year mark. So Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik were both born right before 100 years. They were also both born during the Umayyad Khilafah. Whereas Imam al-Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad, if you look here, they were born after. So they were born during the Abbasid period, both of them. So if you also look at the difference between Imam Abu Hanifa, he passes away in 150 years after Hijrah. That is the same year that Imam al-Shafi'i is born. So there's quite, a couple of decades difference between Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Shafi'i, and especially Imam Ahmad. But a lot of them overlap, as you'll see when we discuss their lives in a little more detail. And a lot of their students and teachers and even themselves, they learned from each other. Okay, so this era of the Mujtahids, right? This era of the Mujtahids, now you're going towards the first 100 years after Hijrah. If somebody's on unmute, please mute yourselves. Okay, so this era of the Mujtahids, we're looking at the beginning of an intricate system of laws, and the beginning of the codification of usul, right? This is the earliest writings of usul start to show up in this era as well. And prior to this, right, you have, if you remember, many of the companions, they moved to different regions, they started teaching in those regions. But this is when a lot of these systems develop and there's debates going on between these systems. So Imam al-Shafi'i, for example, writes responses against Imam Muhammad, who's a student of Imam Abu Hanifa, in terms of some of the methodologies that they use, and in terms of Imam Muhammad's response to Imam Malik's methodology of the amal of Ahl Medina. That's one of the sources that Imam Malik uses. So there's a lot of healthy debate that's taking place during this time, trying to figure out a methodology, trying to work out the best methodology that each of these groups can. And they're also promoting their own methodology, that we think this should be the proper way to understand and extract fiqh, and others are saying that way. This is also the beginning of the time where the Khalifas, they're trying to establish an official position within the Islamic empire as well. Now, at times, there's a sort of malicious intent as well. So sometimes because they want a sort of Islamic backing, that look, I have these pious scholars that are part of my government, that are part of the system, right? They want a sort of write-off that Imam Abu Hanifa is writing the fatwas for me, or he's passing the legal rulings or whatnot. So for different reasons, during this time period, the Khalifas are also trying to place different muftis as official positions or whatnot. Imam Malik during this time is offered to make his book the official law of the land. He rejects that offer eventually. Imam Abu Yusuf is appointed as Qadi during this time as well. Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, as early as this time, Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani is a student of Abu Hanifa. He starts writing on international law, right? So he starts writing, and I think his work on international law is translated as well, if I'm not mistaken. I should have brought it up, but it's downstairs. So it's translated into English, but the original Arabic is there as well. It's not as we understand international law today, but it's in terms of the relationship between the Muslim empire and other empires that surround it or whatnot. This is as early as it gets, right? So not only are they writing in ibadat, in acts of worship, in transactions, sales, and everything of that sort, they are also extending the legal system, right? There's a lot of issues that are arising during this time as well. They're tackling those issues. The Hanafi madhab during this time also creates a category that's known as fiqh al-iftiradi. It's fiqh that certain questions that didn't arise yet, and there would be like, if this and this happens, right, what should we do? If this and this were to happen, what should we do? And they establish an entire work of fiqh based off of that, which at that time, seemed useless in a sense, right? Some of the scholars actually commented on it, saying that we're not from the people that do this type of work or whatnot. But contemporary Islamic fiqh uses a lot of the iftiradi developed by the original Hanafi madhab to establish a lot of the practices today. So for example, some of the iftiradi that was established then during this time was, what if somebody's suspended in the air and they have to pray? How does their prayer work, right? We use this to determine prayer in an airplane or whatnot today. There's a lot of issues with transplants and medical conditions as well, things that did not exist during their time, but they just made up scenarios, and they would say, what if this happened, or what if this was the case, or what would happen then? And they would propose a solution for each one of these situations with reasoning and everything. All right, Imam Shafi'i also starts writing on usul al-fiqh during this time. So this is one of the earliest works of usul al-fiqh. Many recognize this as the oldest work of usul al-fiqh that still survives today. That's his Kitab al-Risala. What is a mujtahid? So before we get into the 4 mujtahid imams, and I know the game is about to start for some people, so if you guys want to go watch that, feel free to do so. Just try to catch up before the next class, inshallah. What is a mujtahid? This is a non-exhaustive list, so we're not going to cover everything that the requirements or that are required from a person to be a mujtahid. But these are certain things that a mujtahid needs to have, right? Needs to possess certain qualities, certain abilities that a mujtahid needs to have. For example, a mastery of the Arabic language, right? You can't be a mujtahid and not understand in-depth Arabic, especially Quranic Arabic. The different qira'at as well, understanding the different modes of recitation, and does that change the meaning? Does that change the ruling or whatnot? And what would the ruling be if you recited in a different qira'at or qira'ah? Profound knowledge of the Quran, the Sunnah, the circumstances of revelation. So that's known as asbab al-nuzul, the reasoning for that revelation. Why was a certain verse revealed? What's the story around it? It helps you understand the context of that verse or hadith for that matter. Knowledge of the disciplines of hadith, right? Understanding how to assess a hadith. Now, if you remember, for those that took the hadith class, the job of the muhaddith is mainly twofold. This is a very basic summarization. It's mainly twofold: to look at the sanad, right? The chain of narration. Number two, to look at the matan, the actual wording of the hadith, to determine that both of these are good to go. That's the job of the muhaddith. The faqih, the scholar of fiqh, the legal scholar, has an additional thing that they look at, which is known as the batin aspect of it, the internal aspect of that hadith, right? There's something that's issuesome with this hadith. Something doesn't seem right about this hadith. It doesn't fit into the legal system. It doesn't fit into the full understanding. And based off of how the tools are used, they'll determine that. And I'll give you one very quick example that we'll probably cover later in a little more detail, is the hadith that's narrated, I believe, in Sahih al-Bukhari, which deals with the forgetful person. That if a forgetful person breaks their fast, then it's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fed that person, and it doesn't break their fast forgetfully, not accidentally. There's a difference. Forgetfully is that you don't remember that you're fasting. Accidentally is you remember, but you did it by mistake. Accidentally is I know that I am fasting, I go for a swim, water goes down my throat, I broke it accidentally. I knew I was fasting, but I broke it. I'm just going through this very fast because it's a side example. Forgetfully is I forgot I was fasting. It wasn't in my mind. I opened the fridge, took a sip of water, and I was like, oh wait, I'm fasting. I didn't remember I was fasting. That's forgetful. So if a person forgetfully breaks their fast, they're not required to make up their fast. Now, the four madhabs have their own opinions on this. The Shafi'i and the Hanbali madhab say it doesn't break your fast. The Hanafi madhab says that it should break your fast. However, istihsanan, we'll talk about what istihsan is. Istihsanan, we'll apply this hadith, it's istihsan through hadith, and it doesn't break your fast here. Imam Malik's madhab, or the Maliki madhab, says it does break your fast and you have to make it up. You're not sinful, but you have to make it up because it goes against qiyas, and this is a khabr wahid. This is a solitary narration. It doesn't matter if it's sahih, it's a solitary narration, and it goes against the principle of qiyas. Therefore, it breaks your fast and you have to repeat that fast. So again, these systems are very different. It's the same hadith. They're looking at the same concept, but they're applying their own systems to it, and then they have their own reasoning why they come to that conclusion. And we'll talk about that in sources, inshallah. So knowledge of the disciplines of hadith, understanding the sciences of hadith and the sciences that revolve around that. Knowledge of the views of the companions. This is very important as well, to understand what the opinions of the Sahaba were, the early successors, the early and the senior tabi'een, what were their opinions on this. And obviously it would be different now if somebody's trying to be a mujtahid now, although there's a lot of debate surrounding it. It would include the knowledge of the madhabs and things like that as well that's present. Knowledge of qiyas, knowledge of one's own society, which is known as urf, culture. So a person, this is also key, right? This is something a little bit off subject, but this is key. In order for not only a person to be a mujtahid, for a person to be a mufti of a certain area, they need to have an understanding of the urf. You cannot import fatwas, right? You can't import fatwas. You can't take a fatwa from a different culture, a different country, and place it somewhere. If you open Kitab al-Qada in the Hanafi books, right, in Hidayah, for example, one of the conditions that I'll mention you'll find is that أن يكون عارفا بالعرف, that person knows and understands the culture of the people, the society of the people. You can't be a mufti in that society without understanding the context. So you can't import fatwas. It doesn't work for the most part, and it goes both ways. You can't apply a fatwa that's given in the US to Saudi Arabia or somewhere else as well, unless everything else lines up and the culture or that doesn't affect it. Then in those cases, rare cases, you can, but the reality is you're not supposed to import fatwas. A mufti, a mujtahid, a qadi needs to understand the urf of the people. Public interest, maslaha. This is also one of the tools of fiqh. Knowing the general objectives, the maqasid, and then also this last thing that I mentioned, this is a non-exhaustive list. So in different madhabs, you'll find different lists. Different writers will also put a large list of things that a mujtahid needs to have. But one of the things is intelligence, personal piety, right? They also look at the outwardness of that person's quote unquote outwardness of their piety, right? A person can't be an open sinner. A person can't be somebody who's known to be engaging in things that are haram publicly. This is part of a person's outward appearance, and a lot of scholars require that from a mujtahid, from a mufti, from certain people that hold positions of within the Islamic legal tradition. So these are some of the conditions of a mujtahid. There's also a thing called a mujtahid in the madhhab. So this is not a mujtahid mutlaq, meaning an absolute mujtahid who has his own madhhab in a sense. This is within the madhhab, they're able to, because the madhhab does not have one opinion. This is another thing that we need to understand. Each madhhab has an entire discourse of what the official position of that madhhab should be. Sometimes there's multiple positions within that one madhhab, especially in the Hanafi madhhab, you'll have multiple positions as well. So mujtahid within the madhhab is able to look at the multiple positions and then say, based off of the certain situation that we are in, or that this person is in, and the certain circumstances around this person's case, this is the opinion that would be applied to this person. That's a mujtahid within the madhhab. And again, the conditions will be relating to understanding how that madhhab works, the works of that madhhab, the opinions within that madhhab. And some of this is not an exhaustive list either. Some of the conditions that apply to a mujtahid would also apply here for a mujtahid in the madhhab. Taqleed, this is not the opposite, but this is somebody who's not pretty much a mujtahid, does taqleed. Taqleed simplistically means to follow, right? The easiest way to understand this means to follow somebody's opinion. The technical terminology is to follow somebody's opinion without either knowing the proofs or seeking the understanding of how they extracted and came to that conclusion. Basically, if I follow the opinions of the Shafi'i school, right, I'm not looking into how did Imam Shafi'i arrive at this conclusion, right? What about this verse? What about that verse? You know, this and that. Now, as you move up, as you start studying fiqh, right, you start looking at these things. You start saying, how did Imam Shafi'i arrive here? How did Imam Abu Hanifa arrive there? What are the differences between this, right? So you're still doing taqleed in a sense, but now you're aware of how these opinions are arrived because you can't derive your own opinions. And then you move up. Eventually, the idea is if a person's capable and they keep moving up, they become a mujtahid in the madhhab itself. So they're able to take the opinions of the madhhab. And below that, in our understanding, is a mufti. So a mufti had the word itself had a very different meaning a very long time ago, and the meaning of the word constantly has changed. So originally, if you go far back, sometimes you'll see the word mufti being used as mujtahid. And now it's used as somebody who can give fatwa. So they can take the principles of the madhab, understand the usul, based off of the situation of a person, they can extract an opinion from within the madhab, within opinions that are already extracted, sometimes outside that one madhab, based off of another madhab even, and give an opinion for that person. And you'll find many of the Darul Iftas, the places of fatwa or the councils of fatwa giving fatwa based off of this. So they'll give an Islamic verdict or an Islamic ruling if somebody asks a question based off of either one madhab, or they'll go outside of that one madhab if that person's condition requires it. But you need a certain level of understanding to get to that level. Aside from that, the average person does taqleed in the sense that, you know, for example, if I asked you, where did you learn how to pray? You probably learned in Sunday school or from your parents, right? Did you sit there and say, where do we get this part of prayer from? Where do we get that you got to tie your hands? Did you ask for proof for everything? If you didn't, then you did taqleed. That's what it is. You follow the result. You follow the legal conclusions that this is how you pray, right? Without going into the details of how. And you can read hadith books and things like that and learn different hadith that talk about the proofs of those things. But again, most of the time, it still falls under the category of taqleed. All right, now we are talking about the four Mujtahid Imams themselves. Bismillah, Imam Abu Hanifa. It doesn't seem anybody left for the Super Bowl, so that's a good sign. All right, so Imam Abu Hanifa, he is the first of the four Mujtahid Imams that we will discuss. These are the Imma al-Arba'a, the four Mujtahid Imams, or the four Imams, or the four fiqh Imams. There's different nicknames for these four people. Imam Abu Hanifa, he's the first of them in terms of his birth. So he's born in the 80th year after Hijrah, approximately 70 years after the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or 69 years, give or take. His name is Nu'man ibn Thabit. So Abu Hanifa is a nickname. His actual name is Nu'man ibn Thabit. And he was born during the Umayyad period under the time of the Khalifa Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. Originally, so there's debate on this, right? Originally, his family is from Afghanistan. So Imam Abu Hanifa, technically in contemporary terms, would be Afghani. Some say his family is from Persia. There's a difference of opinion on the narrations that are there. Some say that originally his grandfather was from Kabul and he moved to Persia. Imam Abu Hanifa was born in Iraq. He was born in Kufa, but his ancestry, his family. So there's a lot of discussion on this. Obviously, people from Afghanistan claim he's Afghani for sure. And same thing with people from Persia, right? And that's a joke. Not everybody does that. So he's from amongst the tabi'i. A tabi'i is a person that met the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Imam Abu Hanifa, there's different narrations, but it's said that he's met 4 companions. Some say 2, some say 3, some say 4. These are the 4 that I put on the screen, but he's met Anas ibn Malik. Now, he didn't narrate from any of these companions that he has met, but the scholars say, right, especially the hadith scholars, that a tabi'i is a person who met a sahabi, even if that person does not accompany that sahabi or narrate from that sahabi. So the condition to be a tabi'i is that you're from the generation who met the sahabi or the sahaba. And Imam Abu Hanifa actually met the companions. There's different narrations on precisely how many, but he's met them. He didn't narrate from them, but he's met them. So he's classified to be from amongst the tabi'i. So his generation is from the early salaf. You have the Prophet ﷺ, the companions, and the first generation after. Now, he's not from what's known as the senior tabi'i, right? The senior tabi'i meaning those that learn from the companions, they sat with the companions, but he's from the junior tabi'i, those that just met the companions. He grew up in Kufa, and early on, he was not somebody who constantly engaged in seeking knowledge or learning Islamic studies or anything of that sort. Rather, he was engaged in commerce as a textile merchant. He traded silk garments. He was a really well-known businessman in that sense. So he was wealthy. He had a lot of prosperity in his trade, and that's what he did throughout his early years. Now, it's mentioned that Imam al-Sha'bi, he met him, and he's the one that originally advised him that he realized Imam Abu Hanifa is very sharp and that he's able to pick up things very quick, and that sort of wit and that sort of strength in terms of legal thinking and in terms of Islamic studies is, the ideal, or he would be the ideal candidate to study Islamic studies. So he advises him to study, and Imam Abu Hanifa takes that advice. So that's traditionally what's known about how he got into Islamic studies. Let's look at some of his teachers. All of these lists, going from Imam Hanifa all the way down to Imam Ahmad, of teachers, students, even books for that matter, they're not exhaustive. So you'll find people that are not on there. We're just mentioning a few of them. We won't even read all of them, but we're just mentioning a few. So there's a couple of people I want to point out, actually. Ash-Sha'bi, the one that advised Imam Hanifa, he's here. If you look over here, they're not in any specific order. Amr ibn Dinar is here as well, right? He's well known from amongst the Tabi'i. Nafi', Mawla ibn Umar, right? So the freed servant of the freed slave of Ibn Umar, who's the companion of the Prophet ﷺ. He was one of the teachers of Imam Abu Hanifa as well. Qatada, right? The famous Mufassir. Imam Abu Hanifa's main teacher is Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, right? Whose teacher is Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, right? Eventually going to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, if you remember the chart from last time. Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, right? So al-Zuhri is a very famous hadith scholar. He was known that the Khalifa told him that start compiling the hadith. So Imam al-Zuhri is one of the teachers of Imam Abu Hanifa as well. Now, a teacher doesn't mean that he studied years with these people, sometimes a small portion, but his main teacher, Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, that was his main teacher for years, until his teacher passed away, and Imam Abu Hanifa actually became or replaced his teacher, right? So in the masajid, what they would have is they would have certain corners, and they would study under under the rawaks actually. So rawak, for those that don't know what it means, it's the arch that you find in the masjids. The old masjids usually have these arches, and under it, there's an area where classes would gather, or the original circles would gather, circles of knowledge. So they would start studying under the rawak, and that's why we actually named Rawak Institute Rawak. It comes from that word, that the earliest gatherings of ilm started under the rawak. And even till this day at Masjid al-Azhar, it's known as the rawak of this, the different corners of the masjid. So rawak of this, rawak of that, rawak of this companion, and those are different corners where they hold classes. Coming back to this, so Imam Abu Hanifa eventually replaces his main teacher. Notable students. Imam Abu Hanifa has two very famous students, right? He has multiple famous students, two, and then you can add a third, Imam Zufar. But his two most famous students, who are known as the Sahibain, are Abu Yusuf, Imam Abu Yusuf, or Qadi Abu Yusuf. He's a judge as well. He was the chief justice or the first chief justice of the Muslim empire. And Muhammad al-Shaybani. Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani is the one who originally wrote the works of the Hanafi madhab. So majority of the Hanafi madhab, it's called Zahir al-Riwayat, comes from the works of Imam Muhammad. So Imam Muhammad wrote the opinions of Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf, the debates between people, everything. He has 6 different books. Some say 5, but 6 is there as well, depending on how you categorize one of his books, if it's part of a larger work or not. And those books are the original works of the Hanafi madhab. Imam Zufar is another student. You'll find his opinions written down by Imam Muhammad as well. These 3 are very famous students. And then there's other students as well, like Abdullah ibn Mubarak, a very famous and pious scholar as well, who people quote his sayings all the time. His own son Hamad, who he named after his teacher as well. His writings, it is said that Imam Abu Hanifa wrote Al-Fiqh al-Akbar. There's debate regarding it, whether it's written by him or by Abu Yusuf, or his original work didn't survive, or if him and Abu Yusuf wrote 2 books by the same name. But some scholars say that he wrote Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, and some say it's not written by him, but rather by his students. Okay, these are, again, some of the things that are well known about Imam Abu Hanifa. He was righteous, right? So not only was he a faqih, a legal scholar, a scholar that's known for his intellect, but he was also a very pious individual. He was known to constantly be in prayer, to pray very long rakahs, right? If you look at the narrations that are said about him, it mentions that he used to recite for a very long time. Some say sometimes the entire Quran in 2 rakahs. There's a lot of reports out there, but the idea behind it is that he used to engage in prayer, especially throughout the night, constantly. And he was known for his piety. So it's not that Imam Abu Hanifa was just a legal scholar that we have, right? He's, again, somebody that's very righteous. He's known as one of the great scholars of his time as well, that people looked up to him for his piety, for his righteousness, for his generosity. He was very wealthy, well put together. He was extremely sharp. He had a lot of wit as well, so he would be able to respond right away. He also, once he took over the position of his main teacher in the year 120 Hijrah, a lot of his students who couldn't afford to study and had to work, he would grant them stipends. So he was very wealthy, and he started this system where his circle would have people with stipends. They would get a monthly stipend, and in exchange, they would dedicate their time studying and not engage in any sort of business. So he had his own business, which had a lot of wealth, bringing in a lot of wealth, and he used that money to fund his students. Now, he would debate his students. What he would do is, his circle was known that they would come up with a scenario or a situation, or even a mas'ala, a fiqhi mas'ala that doesn't have to be a future situation or anything like that. And he would open it up for debate, right? And then he would kind of flaw their debates, or flaw their opinions. So they would go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. until they arrive at different conclusions. So Imam Abu Hanifa didn't simply just lecture. And what's known as the Socratic method, this is used in a lot of law schools as well. I know there's a couple of law students actually taking this class as well. So that was a well-known style of Imam Abu Hanifa, that he wouldn't simply just lecture, rather he'll throw a scenario out there and he'll open the floor for debate. What do you think? And people would arrive at different conclusions until they all arrive at one conclusion. It's mentioned that Imam Abu Hanifa would usually convene the class by breaking down the different sides, the different views, and they would arrive at certain conclusions. And this was generally his style. Imam Abu Hanifa was completely against taking anything from the government or from the ruling party. So he would not take any stipend from the government. He wouldn't even want, as you'll see in the next bullet point, he did not want to be connected with the government in any way, because he thought that that would influence, or it would ruin the independence that he has in terms of his fiqh and his understanding. So he would stay far away from any stipends, any gifts. Anytime the governor or the Khalifa would send him gifts, he would reject it. He would not take it. And eventually the Umayyad governor of Iraq originally tried to appoint him as the chief justice of, or the chief judge of Kufa. He rejected this. He was punished for this. He was actually whipped for this as well for multiple days until eventually they let him go. And then again, later in his life, the Abbasid Khalifa. So remember, Imam Abu Hanifa was alive or was born during the Umayyad period, and then he passes away during the Abbasid period. So he lived in both periods. He lived during the Abbasid revolution that took place in the year 150 Hijra, I believe. So he lived during that time. And during the Abbasid period, the Abbasid Khalifa Abu Ja'far al-Mansur also tried to appoint him, but to a higher post, Chief Justice, right? Which eventually was the position that Abu Yusuf was appointed to. But Imam Abu Hanifa didn't want it. He was thrown in prison for this, for rejecting, and originally the Khalifa approached other senior scholars and told them to convince Abu Hanifa that, convince him to take this position. And if you did the readings, you'll be more familiar with the story. We can't go into the details, but they tried to convince him, and he was like, no, he wasn't having it. And he did not want to put the stamp, his writing or his name on the death penalty or this punishment or that punishment. He didn't want his name going on that. So he stayed far away from that. He was imprisoned, and he actually died in the central prison of Baghdad in 150 Hijra. Sorry, so the Abbasid revolution is not 150 Hijra. It is, let me make that correction now before I have to go back. Did somebody write that? No, nobody wrote that. I have it here. 132 Hijra. That's when the Abbasid revolution takes place. So he passes away in 150 after Hijra, and that is also the same year that Imam Shafi'i is born. Imam Abu Hanifa was about 70 years old, and he was buried in Baghdad, the same city that he died in. Okay, I see there's questions coming in. I'll try to tackle them at the end, inshallah. Again, as I said, this class is one of the two classes, inshallah, not more than that, hopefully, that will go over time. So usually our classes are 1 hour sharp. This one will go slightly over. Imam Malik ibn Anas. Imam Malik was born 93 after Hijra. So he was born, by birth, he's the second Imam, right? So in terms of the timeline, he's the second oldest Imam. He was born north of Medina, in a village north of Medina during the reign of the Umayyad Khalifa, Sulaiman ibn Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, who's the son of the Khalifa that was at the time when Imam Abu Hanifa was born. Imam Malik's family originally comes from Yemen, and he grew up in a noble household, very scholarly. His grandfather was a senior tabi'i who learned from many of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina. So he was a known scholar in Medina. Imam Malik's father, Anas, was not really somebody who was a scholar, but the general family itself was a very righteous and very pious family. So he grew up in that sort of household. And Medina itself, the city, was a place for scholarship. So you have, if you simply look at the birth of Imam Malik, right, 93 after Hijrah. So you're looking at approximately 83 to 82 years after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So about 2 generations, and imagine hundreds of companions that are in Medina, and the people who learn directly from these companions, and then Imam Malik as well, from that catching the end of that next generation, or the people who learn from them as well. So he's right there in this environment that's created by hundreds of companions of the Prophet who learned directly from the Prophet. The time of Umar ibn al-Khattab and Uthman and Abu Bakr and Ali is not far from the time of Imam Malik. There's not 2-3 generations between these senior companions and Imam Malik. So this environment in Medina is very different from the other lands of the Muslims. At the time, at this time especially, the other lands of the Muslims were minorities in many of these regions. Medina was one of those places where they weren't, right? Medina was one of those places where it was filled with companions originally, and then the students of the companions as well. And it was a place of knowledge, a place that you'll find people studying, and you'll find constant circles of knowledge. Imam Malik was known to be extremely stringent when it came to choosing his teachers. So he was very precise. He wouldn't just study with anybody. He was very specific, very picky in a sense, right? Not in a negative way, but very picky in a sense that he would not want to study with simply anybody. That person has to show a lot of piety, a lot of ilm. Everything is very precise about that person. And that's why many of the hadith scholars, they say, if Imam Malik narrates from anybody, we'll take it. We don't need to question. Imam Malik's already done the research. He won't narrate from anybody who he even suspects it could be a weak narrator or could have issues or anything. And many scholars even term, there's difference of opinion, what's known as the golden chain. Some say it's Imam Malik's chain, right? So Imam Malik was known to be very precise. It's also mentioned that Imam al-Bukhari would prefer the chain of Imam Malik, even if it would be longer, right, than other chains that he could find, simply because it had Imam Malik in that chain. So he was a well-known scholar of hadith and a scholar of fiqh as well. Some of his teachers were Nafi', the Mawla of Ibn Umar, the freed slave or the servant of Ibn Umar. This is one of the teachers of Imam Abu Hanifa as well. Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, another teacher of Imam Abu Hanifa as well. Right, so these are, as you can see, these were famous scholars at the generation right above. Imam Abu Hanifa learned from them as well. Imam Malik is learning from them as well. His main teacher was Abdullah ibn Yazid. You see, I marked it all the way at the end. That was his main teacher that he studied for a very long period of time with. Notable students. So the reading I gave you for some reason did not have Imam Shafi'i, unless I missed it, as one of the notable students. But Imam Shafi'i is probably the most famous student of Imam Malik. So if somebody noticed that as well, I'm not sure, but it didn't have, as far as I came across it, I didn't see it. But Imam Shafi'i is actually probably the most famous student of Imam Malik. After that would be Muhammad al-Shaybani. Famous in terms of popularity, not in terms of it carried on the legacy of Imam Malik, because that's other students who carried on the Maliki madhhab, right? Imam Shafi'i eventually started his own madhhab and even wrote polemical works against some of the tools that Imam Malik uses or the Hanafis use or whatnot later on. So Imam Shafi'i is one of the students of Imam Malik. Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, who's also the student of Abu Hanifa and the one that wrote, remember, the Hanafi works, where the Hanafi works, or the Hanafi madhhab was passed down through. Yahya ibn Yahya al-Laythi, Abdul Rahman ibn Qasim, these are all students of Imam Malik. Famous works. So Imam Malik wrote he didn't write, but he compiled the Muwatta. And then it's narrated through different chains. So there's a chain of the Muwatta that's narrated through Imam Muhammad al-Shaybani, who's the Hanafi scholar. And that's what they call the Hanafi version of the Muwatta of Imam Malik. It has Imam Muhammad's own commentary in it. It has his own opinions in it and things like that as well. But the Muwatta of Imam Malik is narrated through many different chains. And it is also narrated in different versions. So if you see one chain, it'll be a slightly different version. It'll have a different organization, or it'll have some hadiths here and there. The reason behind that is Imam Malik taught the Muwatta for more than a decade, right? And at different times of his life, he revised the book. He added things. He took out things. He changed the order. So a student that studied the Muwatta with him from the very beginning, right, early on, and then left back to his country, that's the version of Muwatta he wrote down and memorized from Imam Malik that he went back with and then passes it through that chain. Whereas somebody who came 5 years later, it will be a slightly different version of the Muwatta that's passed through Imam Malik. The Muwatta, if you remember, there's 6 canonical works of hadith. One of them, there's a dispute whether it should be the Muwatta of Imam Malik, right? It should be part of the 6 or not. Imam Shafi'i has a statement that people quote saying that the Muwatta is the most sahih book after the Book of Allah. And again, remember, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, this time period is before Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, and all of that, if you remember the timeline that we did. The Muwatta of Imam Malik is a musannaf, right? So the type of book. If you remember from the hadith course, for those that took the hadith course, there are different types of hadith books. The musannaf. Anybody remember what a musannaf is? It is a test question. You can put it in the chat if you remember what a musannaf is. Anybody? Okay, a musannaf is a type of hadith book that contains somebody wrote something. Let me see. Very good. So it's a collection of hadith by topic. It contains hadith. It contains opinions of the companions, and it contains fiqh. So it's a combination type of book. It's organized by topic. It has hadith. So it'll start with hadith, and it'll have the opinions of the companions, and then it'll have Imam Malik's opinion. And the Muwatta is a very interesting book because he'll mention hadith, and sometimes he'll say, this is the hadith or whatever, and he'll say it's not acted upon, or this is not what the amal is on. So he'll mention the hadith. I think I'm going to save some of the examples for later when we're discussing tools, so we don't take too many times. Yes, we'll do that. So the Muwatta of Imam Malik, that's his most famous work. And then there are different letters that he wrote, smaller works, pamphlets that he has as well, and that are attributed to Imam Malik as well. So Imam Malik is an authority in hadith and fiqh. He's known to be somebody that carried himself well. He's elegant. Imam Malik was, if you can imagine Imam Malik, he's somebody that was well dressed, well put together, somebody that's very sophisticated. He thinks it's, in a sense, he would think that it's disrespectful for a teacher of ilm, of the Islamic sciences, of hadith, to not be well put together, right? He was very adamant about that. And it starts from an early age. So when he first started or wanted to study Islam, his mother was like, let me dress you like a scholar. And she put, robes on him. She tied his turban. She dressed him well from the very beginning. And he comes from that sort of background. So he held that with respect. And this is when you read Imam Malik's life and his personality, this is the vibe that you get from Imam Malik. And he also is known for his strict adherence to the Sunnah. So he was very precise. And if you remember, so it's not related to this class, so I can't even say if you remember, but in terms of what is bid'ah, there's different opinions within the Sunni tradition. One of them goes back to Imam Malik, which is a very restricted definition of what bid'ah is, right? Restricted definition of what is permissible outside of that or whatnot. But it goes back to this idea that Imam Malik was very specific on what he allowed people to do and what he would consider outside the Sunnah. There are different narrations out there. There's one narration that somebody came in the Prophet's masjid, they placed something in front of them and they started praying. Imam Malik got extremely furious, saying, what is this person doing? Why is he placing something? So it has to be precisely done how it was done in Medina, or how the Prophet, it was passed down for the Prophet. Again, that's not the only understanding. There are different understandings, but we're trying to understand Imam Malik here. He was the Imam of Medina at his time, or he became the Imam of Medina. Eventually, the Abbasid Khalifa offered him to make his Muwatta, the official law of the land, and he refused. Imam Malik passes away in the year 179 after Hijrah at the age of 85. And he's buried in Jannat al-Baqi, the graveyard in Medina, where many of the companions are buried as well. So that is Imam Malik. Two more, inshallah. So hopefully we won't be more than 15 to 20 more minutes, inshallah. Imam al-Shafi'i, he's the third Imam in terms of birth. His name is Muhammad ibn Idris. That should have just been a B. Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i al-Qurashi. So Imam al-Shafi'i is from the Quraysh, right? His lineage goes back to the Quraysh. He's Qurayshi. He's born 150 Hijrah, so the same year that Imam Abu Hanifa passes away, in Gaza. It's also narrated that he's born in Yemen as well, right? So some people say Yemen, the most popular version is Gaza. That's another thing. When we're looking at historical aspects of these Imams, don't feel that this is the only method. Sometimes you'll find other narrations out there or whatnot. We're trying to have a basic understanding of these Imams. So Imam Shafi'i's father passes away shortly after Imam Shafi'i is born, and his mother moves to Mecca because she has a lot of relatives in Mecca. Remember, they're Qurayshi. She has a lot of relatives there, so he grows up in Mecca. He begins studying in Mecca, and because he's around people who are speaking very pure Arabic, he's very eloquent in his speech, right? His fasaha, his Arabic is very strong. And Imam Shafi has works of poetry as well. He's written a lot of poetry. So he's memorized the Quran. He also memorized the Muwatta of Imam Malik. Remember, he's a student of Imam Malik as well. He traveled to Medina to study with Imam Malik. Okay. Imam Shafi'i, some of his teachers, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, I believe he was in Mecca. He was one of the main scholars. Muslim, this one here, Muslim ibn Khalid al-Zanji as well. He's one of the main scholars of Mecca, I believe. Malik ibn Anas, again, the main scholar of Medina at that time. Muhammad al-Shaybani, the Hanafi scholar, the student of Imam Abu Hanifa. So Imam Shafi'i is a student of Imam Malik directly, and also a student of Muhammad al-Shaybani, who's a student of Imam Abu Hanifa. Now, Imam Malik, there's a lot of stories revolving the studies of Imam Shafi'i with Imam Malik. I'll share one. Let me see the time actually. Okay, I'll share, inshallah. So this, I remember this story actually vividly. This is in the first year of Al-Azhar, so the first year of the College of Sharia when we were studying, we were preparing for an exam called Tarikh al-Tashri'. So it's the history of the development of Islamic law or fiqh along this timeline, right? And it was on that day that Sheikh Arifi from Saudi Arabia came into Egypt, and he was giving a talk at Al-Azhar. And me and my classmates, we were debating, we were in the finals period, we were debating whether to go to Al-Azhar, to the masjid, and attend this talk, right? It was a big moment. This is the year that Muhammad Mursi was the president. So this is the first or 2 years after the revolution, about approximately. And we were debating whether we should go down to Al-Azhar, attend this talk. It was a big event. Everybody's going there, but we had this exam coming up and we needed to study. I remember my living room being full with papers all over the floor. Like we laid them all down, different charts, different dates, details, everything. And we decided not to go. We said we have to study. So we put it on the TV. So I heard this story, this qissa, through the television from Sheikh Arifi at Azhar. And we put it on the TV and we're studying, and we ended up listening to most of the talk instead of studying, but it was the traveling back and forth. So this is in Cairo, and he's talking about some of the juhud, some of the struggles, and some of the even admiration, in a sense, of these people that went and studied the sciences of fiqh, or the sciences of hadith, and studied hadith and fiqh in the early Islamic sciences that were out there. So he was telling us the story of Imam Shafi'i, and he says Imam Shafi'i was young, and Imam Shafi'i was very poor, right? So Imam Shafi'i, as you can see, his father passed away. He didn't have much. He was very poor. He barely, if you read Imam Shafi'i's stories, he barely had utensils and things to write with. So he would write on whatever he would find. Um, and he went to the circles of Imam Malik. Now, Imam Malik, again, we just discussed Imam Malik is a very serious teacher, right? He doesn't joke around. He's not there to mess around. And he has this understanding of ilm that needs to be there. This, you have to respect knowledge. You have to respect scholars. There's a level of respect that goes into these studies. Imam Shafi'i is sitting, he's young, he's a young kid in his teens. He's sitting in the back and he doesn't have anything to write with. Imam Malik is narrating the Muwatta and he's narrating hadith. And Imam Shafi'i, he's sitting there and Sheikh Arifi goes, he takes his finger and he's just going like this, right? And as Imam Malik is narrating, Imam Malik is teaching and he's serious and he keeps like looking at Imam Shafi'i like, what is this kid doing, right? This kid's sitting in my lecture. First of all, to get to Imam Malik's lecture, you have to graduate from the other circles that are there. You can't just walk into Imam Malik's lecture. And Imam Shafi'i is sitting there and he's just drawing stuff on his hand, right? So afterwards, Imam Malik has a conversation with Imam Shafi'i and says, what are you doing? Like, are you playing around in my class? And Imam Shafi'i's like, no, I was writing down what you're saying, right? And he's like, what do you mean you were writing down what I was saying? So Imam Shafi'i doesn't have papers and pencils or whatever they had at that time to write down stuff. He couldn't afford it. So he said, I would write with my finger on my hand what you're saying. When I finish using up the space, I would wipe it and then I'll start again, right? I'll write again. And Imam Malik is now, he's furious. He's like, what, is he, messing with me? Like, what is this kid doing? So he says, stop playing around or whatnot. This is not a joke. This is like serious ilm and stuff. And Imam Shafi is like, if you want, I can recite everything that you spoke about in class. So he says, show me. So he goes from the very beginning, hadith by hadith by hadith by hadith, in the same exact order that Imam Malik narrated these hadith, one by one, all the way until the entire complete lesson, from the beginning to the end, word by word, the sanad, the people in the sanad, everything about it. And Imam Malik was extremely impressed. Now, there are many different stories that revolve around this journey of Imam Shafi'i with Imam Malik and the studies. Imam Shafi'i also tried to convince Imam Malik to let him skip the junior classes because he was capable. Imam Shafi'i very likely had a photographic memory because he was able to memorize anything that he sees. So it's very likely that he did have a photographic memory. All right, coming back here. Again, that was a side story that I just shared with you guys. It was not part of the reading or anything. Some of his notable students, right? So let's talk about Imam Ash-Shafi'i's his students. Al-Buwaiti. Al-Buwaiti is one of his main students, Al-Buwaiti and Al-Muzani, right? These two people actually carried the works of Shafi'i afterwards. They were both his students in Egypt. All right, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Imam Ahmad studied fiqh with Imam Shafi'i, and it's said, some people say that Imam Shafi'i actually studied hadith with Imam Ahmad as well. So they both studied with each other, but Imam Shafi'i is generally known as the teacher for Imam Ahmad in terms of his fiqh. And also Ishaq. Ishaq is a famous muhaddith as well. All right, famous writings or famous works. Imam Shafi'i has two major works, Kitab al-Risala and Kitab al-Umm. Kitab al-Risala is his work on usul al-fiqh, so the principles of fiqh, right? These principles or tools that we talked about, and that actually I think our next class might be about the primary sources, then we're going to talk about the secondary sources. But these sources, Imam Shafi'i wrote an entire book on this. And then Kitab al-Umm, which is his fiqh book. Imam Shafi'i also has works that are or opinions that are from his time in Iraq, and then he has opinions that are from Egypt, which are known as the old madhhab, the new madhhab, and there's differences of opinion on how to use these madhabs. Imam Shafi'i also has polemical works, right? So Radd ala Muhammad ibn Hassan. Muhammad ibn Hassan, the student of Abu Hanifa, he wrote a response to Imam Malik, some of the tools that he used. And then Imam Shafi'i, defending Imam Malik, his teacher, wrote a response to Muhammad ibn Hassan. And eventually Imam Shafi'i later in his life also wrote a response to some of the tools of Imam Malik as well. So these were healthy debates and writings back and forth, trying to argue why somebody else's principle shouldn't be used and why this principle should be used. He also has other smaller works as well, like the differences between Imam Abu Hanifa and Abu Layla, and many other smaller works too. Imam al-Shafi'i, he traveled to many places to study, as we talked about some of them. He traveled to Medina, Yemen, Baghdad, Egypt. His last place was Egypt, actually. While he was in Yemen, he served in public office. So he held a position in public office until he was arrested. So it's mentioned that some people were, out of jealousy, they accused Imam al-Shafi'i of siding with the Alawi rebels, right? So the Shia rebellions, and then he was brought to Iraq, and he was eventually acquitted on these charges, and he started studying in Baghdad and with Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, the student of Imam Abu Hanifa. He also taught in many places. So Imam Shafi'i taught in Mecca, he taught in Egypt, he taught in Baghdad, right? So he taught in different places. So he has students all over. His last and final place, obviously, was Egypt, where he passed away in the year 204 after Hijrah at the age of 54. So all of this is within 54 years, right? Which is pretty impressive. MashaAllah. All right, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the last Imam that we're doing. Bismillah. Oh, sorry, this chart. Okay. Imam Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal, that's his full name. He was born 164 after Hijrah in the city of Baghdad during the Abbasid period. His father was a soldier and he was stationed in Baghdad, but his father passed away when he was 30. And at that time, Imam Ahmad was 3 years old, so he became an orphan. Around the age of 16 is when he started studying, right? So he started studying, and it's mentioned he's traveled to various places. Baghdad, that's supposed to be Kufa, Basra, Mecca, Medina, Yemen, Syria, the Arabian Peninsula. So he started going to different places and studying, right? He studied with, remember, Imam al-Shafi'i. It's mentioned he studied or narrated from Imam Abu Yusuf as well. You guys remember who Imam Abu Yusuf is? He is the student of Imam Abu Hanifa, right? So Imam Abu Hanifa, he had two major students, Abu Yusuf and Muhammad al-Shaybani, Qadi Abu Yusuf. Imam Ahmad first began his studies with hadith. So he specialized in hadith in the beginning. These are some of his notable teachers: Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam al-Shafi'i, Waqi' ibn Jarrah, Sufyan ibn Uyayna, Yahya ibn Mu'in, right? These are teachers of Imam Ahmad. Some of his notable students: Imam al-Bukhari, right? So Imam al-Bukhari narrates from Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Imam Muslim, right? Sahih Muslim is the works of Imam Muslim ibn Hajjaj. Imam Abu Dawood, right? Some people say he narrates from Imam Ahmad and studied with Imam Ahmad as well. And Abu Dawood is the author of Abu Dawood. These are three of the authors of the 6 canonical works of hadith, the 6 major works of hadith. 3 of them studied with Imam Ahmad. So as you can already see, Imam Ahmad had a lot more influence in hadith. And his general fiqh style, his madhhab, is very hadith based. Some would argue that Shafi'i's works are actually more. So Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad, we need to understand the relation between them. Imam Ahmad's fiqh mainly is a lot of the Shafi'i principles and eventually branches off, right? So Imam Ahmad's major fiqh ideas mainly are grounded in the Shafi'i usul system, and then it branches off to its own usul, or to its own madhab. However, some scholars say that the differences between the Shafi'i and the Hanbali madhab are not enough to separate Imam Ahmad's madhab as a separate madhab, right? So the majority view, or the common view, is that there's 4 major madhabs, right? The Hanafis, the Malikis, the Shafi'is, and the Hanbalis. There is a view out there that it says Imam Ahmad's madhab is not too different from Imam Shafi'i's madhab, although there are differences within, but they say it's not enough to determine it a completely separate system itself. So it's very similar to the Shafi'is in that sense, and that's why you'll find the opinions are close in many aspects. Famous writings: the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. The Musnad is a type of hadith book as well, just like we did the Musannaf is a type of hadith book that bases it on topics. The Musnad bases it off of, anybody know? It's given in the word. It's organized based off of the sanad, the chain. During Imam Ahmad's time, the mihna, the inquisition takes place. Inquisition was when um, the whole controversy revolving around the createdness, quote unquote, of the Quran, whether the Quran is created or not. The big debate between the Mu'tazila and the Sunnis, who were known at that time as the Hanbalis or the Ahl Hadith, the people of Hadith at that time. Again, these are terms that develop over time and used in different ways over time as well. So the mihna takes place. During the mihna, Imam Ahmad is jailed for refusing to acknowledge what the Khalifa is saying about the createdness of the Quran. So he holds on to his position. Eventually, the mihna fails, right? This idea of imposing the state's view of the createdness of the Quran, the Mu'tazila view, fails. And Imam Ahmad's view prevails. So Imam Ahmad becomes the main kind of scholar of Sunniism at that time from an Aqidah perspective as well. So that if you look at the realm of Aqidah, Imam Ahmad is discussed a lot in the very beginning in terms of his positions against the Mu'tazila. This is a quote from Imam Ahmad with the ink pot to the grave. Sounds a lot better in Arabic, but it basically means that the scholarship doesn't end until you reach your grave. That the studying itself continues, right? You continue studying. There is no such thing as, you're a senior scholar, you're done, right? You're continuously studying, you're learning something new every single day with the ink pot to the grave, that you're continuously writing and studying and engaged in scholarship until you pass away. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal passed away in the city of Baghdad in the year 241 after Hijrah at the age of 77. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of them and grant them Jannatul Firdaus and forgive their sins and have mercy on them. These were the four great Imams, or the four Mujtahid Imams that we have of fiqh. Okay. Let's just repeat. This is a short chart showing the overlap of the Imams' lives. So Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik, there was about 57 to 60 years that both of them were alive at the same time, like during their lifetime, that overlaps. Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, about 29 years. Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad, about 40 years. They're both alive. It doesn't mean that they studied with each other for this many years. It's just that during their lifetime, this is how many years overlap. This is a chart that I found from Google. I did not make this. It shows the predominant madhabs, or the schools of thought or jurisprudence that are followed in the Muslim world. So if you see, let's start with the Maliki madhab. You have the Maliki madhab in most of North, West, and even mid-Africa here. And then you can see these dotted lines. The dotted lines means it's a mixed. So you have a mix of, in this Central Africa area and some of West Africa, you have a mix of the Shafi'i madhab and the Maliki madhab. But if you look in Northern Africa, this area, Libya, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, it's all a strong Maliki stronghold. If you look here, the Emirates as well, I can't see it, it's too small, but the Emirates is Maliki as well officially. Hanbali is in Saudi Arabia, right? Oman is not marked. Does anybody know why Oman is not marked in one of these circles? Oman follows the Ibadi school, right, which is a minority school. The Omanis are Ibadi by fiqh and by aqidah as well. All right, then you have the Hanafi school. So you have Turkey, areas in Europe and Southern Europe. You have the mountain regions in Russia. You have China, where the Uyghur Muslims are, right? That's all Hanafi area. Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Afghanistan. Iran is Shia as well. So Iran actually follows the Ja'fari madhab. Right? So Iran, the Ja'fari madhab that we spoke about, is followed in Iran. The Zaydi madhab you have in Yemen, right? So this, I guess this green dark area, because it shows you Shia, is most likely where the Zaydi madhab will be followed. And then for the Shafi'is, you have this area, right? So Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia, going down into Malaysia, Indonesia. Those countries are predominantly Shafi'i. And most of these places won't even know it, but if you grew up in one of these places or that's where you're from, very likely you're following that madhab, right? Without knowing that you're following the Hanafi madhab or the Maliki madhab. That's just the practices you learn, and that's perfectly fine. You don't need to know that it comes from this, it comes from that, right? That's the concept of following the established principles from a mujtahid. Here in Egypt, right, it has a bunch of colors circled, and that's because you'll find all of these madhabs in Egypt. So you'll find the Hanafis and the Shafis mainly in Egypt. Al-Azhar teaches all four madhabs, so you can specialize in one of the madhabs, and it focuses on comparative as well. And also practiced in Egypt is, depending on which village you're from, is these different madhabs as well. It's an influence extending from Al-Azhar. So many of the Egyptians that study at Al-Azhar, some of them will study the Hanafi madhab or the Shafi madhab, then go back to their villages, and that's what they teach their villages. And that's what becomes common in those villages. So you'll have all of these madhabs present there. Also, the official ahwal shakhsiyya of the government is a lot based on Hanafi madhab as well. All right. Here is another chart. This is from Feed. And this is the birthplace of the Imams. So these orange, light orange ones are the Imams of fiqh, and then the dark orange ones are the Imams of hadith. This chart is also from Google, and it belongs to Feed. And that brings us to the end, alhamdulillah. So that's about 1.5 hours. So inshallah, this is one of two classes that will be longer than the rest of them. We'll open it up for Q&A, but before